Yeah, it's preparing to live stream.
Looks like it is. Looks like we're here.
Yeah, you can start.
Okay. Good day, everyone. My name is Kevin Gallagher, Director of the Global Development Policy Center here at Boston University. Our mission is to advance policy-oriented research on financial stability, human well-being, and the environment across the globe. And welcome to our China Global Research Colloquium, a weekly seminar series where researchers at the Global Development and Policy Center and from across the world present their ongoing preliminary and finished work on the economic, social, and environmental impacts of China's economic activity around the world. Before I introduce today's topic and today's speaker, let me just invite you to a couple events that we're having over the next couple days. Tomorrow, we will be welcoming the Chinese executive director to the International Monetary Fund, Dongsha Jin. That'll be at 9 a.m. at this same station here. And on Monday, we'll be having a very interesting event. The GDP Center is co-authoring a report that is calling for a globally ambitious debt relief effort, given the fact that the COVID-19 crisis is causing severe debt unsustainability across the emerging market and developing countries. But analogous to the debt relief effort of 1997, which was called the HIPC, this one we're calling should be calibrated to the Sustainable Development Goals of the Paris Climate Agreement. And we'll be joined by the Honorable Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, and the Honorable Gordon Brown, the former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Next week, speaking of debt distress, we will have our own non-resident research fellow Yan Wang at next Wednesday's meeting of the Global China Research Colloquium, 9 o'clock on Wednesday. She's going to be talking about Chinese investment and Southern Africa's debt distress. Today, we're really happy to have our own Xia Li. Xia Li is a Ph.D. student at Boston University's Questrom School of Business and also a Global China Fellow here at the Global Development Policy Center. She's going to be presenting a paper on physical climate risks and overseas investments. The way these seminars go, the presenter speaks for around 25 minutes, and then we have a global conversation with all of you folks. If you look at the bottom of your Zoom, you'll see a little Q&A button. Please click in there, introduce yourself, and ask any question that you might have. And after Xia is done with her presentation, I will field 3 or 4 of them at a time and ask them to her, and so she can respond in conversation with you. But please do introduce yourself so we can all get to know each other. So it's a great joy to welcome Xia Li to the colloquium and look forward to your presentation. Xia, take it away.
Thank you very much, Kevin. And good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining the discussion. So I'm Xia from Questrom School of Business, Boston University, and I'm also a research fellow at GDP Center. And I greatly appreciate the support from the GDP Center on this research project. Let me share my screen. Yeah. So today, I'm very excited to present the preliminary results of the project I work with Kevin Gallagher, which is about physical climate risk and firms' overseas investment. So first, some motivation for this project. So this chart is the most updated World Economic Forum Global Risk Landscape, which is based on survey from more than 1,000 responses from business, government, civil society, and thought leaders. So a global risk is expected to have significant negative impact for several countries or industries within 10 years. And for the first time, they put failure of climate change mitigation and adaptation as a top risk. And it's also the first time one category, the environment and all climate risk related, occupy the top 5 spots. So climate change risk is interlinked with many other risks, and can lead to financial failure while different channels, such as involuntary migration, social instability, and unemployment. So some other photos that visualize some of the physical climate risks, which you might be quite familiar with. Physical climate risks, such as heat stress, wildfire, water stress, flooding, sea level rise, hurricanes, and typhoons, have been bringing impacts on firms across industries, from damages to business interruptions and increased operational costs, and many others as well. As most of you are aware of, California's largest utility company, PG&E, filed for bankruptcy protection back in 2019 because of the wildfire that is associated with climate change. Also, some of Russia's oil and gas fields are at risk from thawing permafrost due to climate change. In 2020, heavy rains and floods also severely affect a lot of provinces in China, and the flooding was described as the worst within the 20 years. So all these different phenomena show that physical impacts of a changing climate are already being experienced and are expected to increase. As such, understanding firms' climate risks and how do firms respond is very important. Yet a lot of studies focused on firms' environmental impact and carbon emissions, which are of course extremely important, but there is much less attention on the impact of physical climate risks on firms. And this comes to our research questions of these projects. Number one, what's the landscape of physical climate risks of firms' overseas assets? Number two, are there systematic differences between Chinese and non-Chinese overseas assets regarding physical climate risk? And if yes, what might be the key driver of it? So we focus on Chinese overseas assets for a couple of reasons. First, China is now the largest investor in least developed countries in developing Asia, and the fourth largest investor in Africa. And on the other hand, Chinese overseas projects are qualitatively unique, and they help with local economic development, while also sometimes being criticized for bringing negative social and environmental impact. Okay, first some preview of this project. So we find that physical climate risks of firms' overseas facilities vary by industry. Mining industry has relatively high floods and sea level rise risks. Agriculture has high water stress and heat stress, while wholesale trade has high hurricanes and typhoons risks. We look at China as a host country of overseas facilities and find that overseas facilities in China, including Hong Kong, have high physical climate risk, with the exception of heat stress, compared with that in other countries with high FDI inflow stock. We also focus on firms headquartered in China, and we find that overseas assets owned by Chinese firms have higher average physical climate risks across countries, with the exception of heat stress. And this is driven by the locations or host countries of these overseas facilities. However, we find that Chinese overseas assets have lower than average physical climate risks within the host countries they are located in. Okay, let's now dive into the details of the data and analysis. So for this project, we are using firm-level climate risk score from 427, which is a Moody's affiliate. So 427 has leveraged published data and also climate modeling to measure the impact of physical climate change on firms and facilities. It compares the 2013 to 2014 climate projections against the historical baseline using climate models. And the differences provides a basis of how climate is expected to shift over time at a given location. So 427 combines these projections with other environmental risk datasets to gain a comprehensive view of exposure to future climate risks, given current conditions. There are 5 major physical risks associated with climate change are covered, which are heat stress, water stress, floods, sea level rise, and hurricanes and typhoons. So all different indicators are transformed into scores ranging from 0 to 100. So scores consider facilities' geographic exposure to climate hazard, as well as business sensitivity to those different hazards. There are 2,233 public firms with more than 1 million facilities are covered in the data, and among them, around 10% are Chinese firms. So this table provides descriptive statistics of climate risk scores. As you can tell, different risk drivers, such as heat and water stress, have different indicators, but they have all been transformed into simple scores ranging from 0 to 100, so it's easier for comparison purpose. Also, please note that these statistics only covers facilities owned by major public firms that covered in 427 data. So first, we look at physical climate risks of firms' overseas assets by industries. As you can tell from the chart, overall, agriculture and mining industries have high climate risks. Agriculture, forestry, fishing sector has high heat stress and water stress. Manufacturing, as well as agriculture sectors, have high water stress. Mining sector has floods risk, as well as high water stress. Wholesale trade sector has high hurricanes and typhoons exposure. And for sea level rise, the risk is similar across different industries. Second, we look at climate risks of overseas facilities by host country. So we have data for all host countries of overseas facilities, but here, for simplicity reasons, we only present the top 10 countries with highest FDI inflow stock based on the World Bank data. Overall, facilities in China and Hong Kong have high climate risk. Specifically, facilities in Brazil have high heat stress. And overseas facilities in China have high water stress and flood risk. Facilities in Hong Kong have high hurricanes and sea level rise risks. And following that, we focus on overseas facilities by firms' headquarter countries. So again, we have data of most countries, but here only presents the top 10 countries with highest FDI outflow stock based on the World Bank data. And overall, facilities owned by mainland Chinese and Hong Kong firms have high climate risks. For heat stress, actually, risks are similar across firms headquartered in different countries. Facilities owned by Canadian firms have slightly higher risk. Overseas facilities owned by mainland Chinese firms have high water stress and floods risks, while facilities owned by Hong Kong firms have high hurricanes and sea level rise risks. So, based on these descriptive statistics, it appears that overseas facilities owned by mainland China and Hong Kong firms have high climate risks. But these descriptive statistics can only show that there might be differences across countries and across industries. Are these differences statistically significant? Is it driven by the industry differences? For instance, do Chinese firms focus a lot on industries with high climate risks, such as mining? Or is it driven by specific host countries? For instance, do Chinese firms' overseas assets mainly locate in countries with high climate risks, such as in Indonesia? Or is it driven by some specific firm characteristics? So to answer these questions, we ran the following regression analysis. In the first regression, we have the industry fixed effect and examine whether Chinese facilities have different climate risks within industry but across different host countries. Second, we added the country fixed effect on top of the industry fixed effect and examine whether Chinese overseas facilities have higher or lower climate risks within industry and within host countries. And for both of these regressions, we control a couple of firm level statistics, such as the firm size, cash, ROA, leverage, etc. And we also weighted the facility counts in each country, in each industry, when running the regressions. And for the outcome variable physical climate risks, we divided them into different risk drivers, including heat stress, water stress, floods, sea level rise, hurricanes, and typhoons. So here is the result for the first regression, and we only control industry fixed effect here. So we find that across countries, Chinese overseas assets have higher climate risk, with the exception for heat stress, compared with overseas assets owned by non-Chinese firms. So these differences is economically and statistically significant. And the differences is particularly large for hurricane risk. However, when we added country fixed effect and conduct the analysis within country and within industry, we find that within countries, Chinese overseas assets don't have higher physical climate risks. In fact, except for the heat stress, they have lower than average physical climate risks in the same host country compared with overseas assets owned by non-Chinese firms in the same country. So what do the two tables tell us? It shows that the higher climate risks of Chinese overseas assets across countries is driven by the locations or host countries of Chinese overseas assets. In other words, Chinese overseas facilities are located in countries of higher physical climate risks. And to further check this finding, we compare overseas assets in BRI, which is Belt Road Initiative, and non-BRI countries. Because China has invested a lot in BRI countries in the last decade. And this is also reflected in the 427 data. Of the 2,233 public firms covered in the 427 data set, around a quarter of the overseas facilities are located in BRI countries. However, if we only focus on Chinese firms covered in the data, they are around 3/4 of their overseas assets are located in BRI countries. And if we compare the overseas facilities in BRI and non-BRI countries, we find that climate risks of facilities in BRI countries are significantly higher with the exception of hurricanes and typhoon risk. And on top of that, we also conduct similar regression analysis, focusing on overseas assets only in BRI countries. We find that within BRI countries, Chinese overseas assets have lower climate risk, such as water stress, floods, and hurricanes. And for heat stress and sea level rise risk, they are not significantly higher. So all these additional analyses further support our earlier argument, which is Chinese overseas assets have higher physical climate risks across countries, and it's driven by the locations or host countries of their overseas facilities. And in other words, the physical climate risk of Chinese assets are higher because they are concentrated in countries with high climate risks, not because they take higher risks within different countries. Okay, here is a recap of what we discussed in the last 15 minutes. So we find physical climate risk of firms' overseas facilities vary by industry. In particularly, mining industry has high floods and sea level rise risks. Agriculture has high water stress and heat stress. Wholesale trade industry has high hurricanes and typhoons risk. So when we focus on China as a host country, we find that overseas facilities in China have high physical climate risk, with the exception of heat stress, compared with that in other countries with high FDI inflow stock. And when we focus on firms headquartered in China, we find Chinese overseas assets have higher average physical climate risks across countries. And this is driven by the locations of their overseas facilities. And Chinese overseas assets have actually lowered the average physical climate risks within host countries. So some policy implications. Our research provides insights on firms' physical climate risk by industry, by country, and by some of the firm characteristics. And it may provide implications to policymakers in setting up effective climate change adaptation policies or guidelines. A couple of international finance institutions have started to take climate risks into consideration. For instance, the latest version of Equator Principle, the 2020 version, has incorporated climate risks assessment into the guideline, and climate risk assessment, including both physical climate risk as well as transitional climate risk. Also, Green Investment Principle for the Belt and Road, which is initiated by the Green Finance Committee of China Society for Finance and Banking and the City of London Corporation, also asks for climate resilient infrastructure development and push projects to disclose climate risk under the TCFD guideline, which stands for Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. Also, as more and more investors, lenders, insurers, and other stakeholders are incorporating climate risks into decision-making, understanding the firm-level heterogeneity of climate risk can provide insights to managers as well as stakeholders. Okay, some discussion on limitations of the project and future research. So our data have some limitations. Although we have collected novel climate risk data at facility level, they are cross-sectional data. We don't know how firms make choices on locations across time. So in the future research, we plan to collect panel data within industry, for instance, like the power industry, and examine firm location choices under physical climate constraints, and hope we can discuss more about the theory of firm location choice under climate risks and uncertainties. So with that, thank you very much, and I look forward to any questions or comments you have. Thank you very much.
Terrific job, Xia. Again, I want to welcome everyone to ask any questions that you might have of Xia Li. If you look at the bottom right-hand side of your Zoom here, there's a Q&A box. Please introduce yourself and ask your question. I'll take 3 or 4 of them, ask them to Xia, and let her respond, and hopefully we can do a couple rounds of that, given that we have close to a half hour here. I'll start with the first 3, Xia, if I may. The first one is from Nora Sazmakat, who's from Ergowald, an organization doing a lot of work on the BRI and its overseas environmental impacts. And Nora asks, how do you define BRI countries? China itself has no exact definition or list, and regions belonging to the BRI are fluid. Mira, who is from the University of Kerala, just asks, could you please elaborate on the data source used in your study, a little bit more on the 427 data and how they look at what they do. Then we also have our good friend from the International Institute for Sustainable Development and the China Council for International Cooperation on Environment and Development, Scott Vaughn. Great to have you here, Scott. He says, thanks for an excellent presentation, Xia. He says, what policy options would you recommend? Existing portfolio of BRI assets enhance resilient spending of existing assets, as opposed to new screening tools for future FDI, question mark? Is there a risk of stranded assets here? Maybe let me repeat that because I don't think I read it so well. What policy options would you recommend, question mark? Existing portfolio of BRI assets enhance resilient spending of existing assets, as opposed to new screening tools for future FDI? And is there a risk of stranded assets? Divya Narain from the University of Queensland asks, is there any data, even if anecdotal, on how these physical risks have translated into financial risks for firms? For example, increased insurance costs or reduced asset values? And I'll ask one more, and then we'll take a break, and you can respond to all these. From Hongbo Yang, a postdoctoral fellow here at the GDP Center, he says, excellent research and presentation. He says, regarding the risk data at the firm level, did the assessment consider mitigation infrastructure available at the host countries? Infrastructure matters for some of the risks, such as flood and water stress. That's a big set of initial questions. Why don't you take a second and respond to those, and I invite other folks to put more questions in the Q&A. We should be able to do another round or two. Take it away, Xia.
Okay, thank you very much for all these questions. I will try to answer most of them. So yes, for BRI countries, the definition. So yes, there's no definite definitions of BRI countries, and the list, I think it's changing over the years. So we use different sources to we actually include the analysis into BRI countries in the data. We try different sources in the analysis, and we for all of them we find similar results. Okay, and so for the questions on the data source, so what we used are the data from 427. So it's a firm based in California, and it's Moody's affiliate. So we purchased the data from them, and they have the firm level as well as the facility level climate risk data. So our analysis is based on their raw data. And the other question regarding the policy options. So what kind of policy recommendations could we have? Actually, a lot of firms have a lot of choices, as I think Scott have mentioned. They could either enhance the resilience, they could conduct some risk management measures, and they could have a lot of other more strategic measures, such as relocate to places of less climate risks, or they could diversify their portfolio. So actually firms have different choices and it's firm's choice. But for our recommendations here, but first and foremost, we need to have a picture of these climate risks. We need to have the baseline. And based on this data and informations, both firms can make like informative decisions, as well as like policymakers could have like more informative decision makings based on the situations in that country and in that locations. And I think in terms of the stranded assets, I think that's more related. We didn't have like analysis compare stranded assets and others. And that is probably more related to climate mitigations, those kind of policies. But here, our focus is only on the physical climate risks, which is more about like the assets locations. So the next question is that how these physical risks have translated into financial risks of firms. Like, yes, actually, all these scores are based on the assessment of impact, like economic impact on these firms. So if larger or greater the scores, which indicate like larger financial and economic impacts, and these could be like translated into either insurance cost or like reduced asset value. And actually in one of my other research, which is more focused on like this, what is the impact of risks on firms and impact on how firms will respond to these risks. So which is another very interesting study, but it's not the focus of the current research scope. And question from Hong Bo about did the assessment consider mitigation infrastructure available at the host countries? I think what Hong Bo means mitigation here is, does it include whether firms try to mitigate or adapt to these physical climate risks? And the simple answer is when 427 like trying to get these climate risk data, they didn't consider like firm level adaptation mitigation to these risks. So it is only based on like two major factors. One is the locations of these assets, and number two is the industry of these facilities. So which kind of capture the sensitivity of the facilities to the climate risks. But for firms, whether they have done additional measures to mitigate or adapt to these risks, it's not like covered under this data set. Okay, I think that's most of my answer to all these questions.
Great job. Now we'll move on to a couple more. We have James Sundquist, a Ph.D. student at Yale and also a pre-doctoral fellow here at the Global China Initiative, and gave a great presentation a couple weeks ago. He says, I see that you're a lecturer of strategy at BU's Questrom School of Business. Could you elaborate on the strategy of Chinese firms? Why have they chosen to expose themselves to higher physical and climate risk? Is his question. And we have Kahan Wong, also a GCI fellow here. And he asked, do you imply Chinese investments are disproportionately in Southeast Asia, considering the hurricane risk along the BRI? And I think I see one more here, excuse me. Yes, Alejandra Saravia Lopez says, excellent presentation. She's from the IESE from Bolivia. And she asked, to what extent do your findings update the debate on the pollution haven hypothesis? If folks are familiar with the pollution haven hypothesis, that's the hypothesis that that firms in countries that have high levels of environmental regulation may move to countries with lower levels of environmental regulation. In economic theory terms, countries with lower levels of environmental regulation might be perceived as being factor abundant in the ability to pollute. And so that might trigger firms in countries with higher regulations to move to those with lower regulations, which obviously would increase net pollution in the global economy. So why don't we take those three and see if there's one more round after that.
Sure, thank you, Kevin. So regarding James' question, could you elaborate the strategy of Chinese firms? Why have they chose to expose themselves to higher physical climate risks? Well, that's a great question, although we don't think our current analysis could answer that, but that is definitely the direction we are heading to, is that, well, currently we only find that Chinese firms, they chose to be located in countries like with higher climate risks. And well, those projects, a lot of them are possibly political driven, but why does it happen? So there are some, like we have a couple of guesses, but we cannot test it for now, because as I said, we don't have the like data across time. We don't know like how firms make choices across time. So it's difficult to answer that directly. But some of the guesses is that, number one is that it's possible that, like, because Chinese firms, they start to invest overseas, like in those projects, only in those like recent 1 or 2 decades. So it's very recently. And it's possible that they have much less choices compared to a lot of firms in other countries. They could like pick up like maybe better like locations with lower risks. And when Chinese firms like start to invest here, it's possible they have less choices, but still they need those overseas investments, so they could potentially take higher risks. That's one hypothesis. And there are also some other hypotheses we are thinking. It's also possible that, as you can tell, that in China, including Hong Kong, so locally they have like higher climate risks for most of the risk drivers, with the exception of heat stress. Is it because they are located in like higher risk regions? They kind of firms start to develop like measures to adapt to those risks, so that when they have overseas investments, they may also like have higher capabilities to take those risks. But that's also, again, it's a guess. We cannot test these hypotheses within like by using our current data set. But both Kevin and I agree that it's an extremely interesting questions, and we would love to seek more answers to that. And regarding Ke Han's question, so do we imply Chinese investments are disproportionately in Southeast Asia, considering the hurricane risk alone, BRI? Well, as showed in the data, Chinese investments, overseas investments, are disproportionately. Well, there are a lot of investments in Southeast Asia, but also in some other, like a lot of BRI countries, and possible in those countries, as I compare the risks within BRI countries and non-BRI countries, they have like higher risks. So they have those kind of differences. We could further do the research and analyze as a next step, like to see like in our data set, which area Chinese investments are like focusing on, which drives the high hurricane risks and other like different kind of risk. Yes, I think that's a good suggestion. We can do more like analysis at the granular level in different regions. And regarding the last question, to what extent your findings update the debate on pollution heaven hypothesis? Actually, quite the contrary. We didn't contribute directly to the pollution heaven hypothesis, because for those group of literature, it's focused a lot about firms' environmental impacts, the externalities on firms, that some firms might go to countries with less regulations and pollute more. So what we did here is what we're trying to analyze quite the opposite part. It's not about firms' impact on the environment. We focus on the the impact of environment, in particular the climate risks on the firms. And we think there are some interesting findings there and could potentially extend the theory of like firms' location choices based on additional constraint here by the climate constraint. Okay, so I think that answers the 3 questions.
Yeah, great. Let me expand on that one a little bit and see if we get another question or two. If not, we can end a little earlier. But this is important. This is an important question for sort of academic thinking, how to think about some of this stuff. So, like Xia said, the pollution haven hypothesis is really, well, does the lack of environmental regulation somewhere in the world trigger firms to move to those countries so that they can pollute more? And so there'll be, it's on the production side that there be more pollution. Okay, when we're thinking about physical and climate risk, these are environmental impacts that are already occurring, economic impacts that are already occurring because, you know, firms in the north and industrialization over time has changed the climate and has started to cause these damages around the world. Okay, so the externality has already been sort of pushed off onto the rest of the world over time, and currently by those countries that emit a lot of carbon dioxide. What this is about is how do firms make investment decisions under fat tails? They don't understand the potential of more hurricanes or more heat stress or drought when they're investing in a particular agricultural set of lands or something like that. So it's very different in the sort of world of academic and economic theory in particular. This is really more about firm location under uncertainty. Right? To what extent are you going to have a normal distribution of the kinds of costs and benefits that you might get when you locate to a particular place? It's hard to tell because you don't know necessarily what the incidence of one of these risks might be that could really have a big impact on your firm. So it's a very different way of thinking about international firm location. It's not, am I going to move to a country so I can pollute more? It's more, companies and countries have been polluting for a couple hundred decades, and it's changed the climate and caused a more risky environment for firms to move around the world on. And how do firms incorporate that risk and uncertainty as they move around the world? What we find is across countries that China's firms tend to be correlated with countries with relatively higher physical climate risk. And that gets back to James' question, to what extent are Chinese firms thinking about these risks, gathering information about these risks as they move around the world? That is largely in its infancy, but Ma Jun, the former head of the former chief economist of the People's Bank of China, and others in London put together a framework on a set of guidelines which include trying to incorporate some of those things in BRI investments overseas. Well, as I went on with a little filibuster there, we got a couple more questions. So why don't I ask these last two, and then any final remarks that you might have. From one of our good friends, Ateng Ballesteros. She says, thanks for the presentation, excellent work. Follow up to Hongbo's question, what are opportunities to engage with Chinese firms and state-owned enterprises on physical and climate risks? What can international partners do in this space as well? And finally, Du Wei Chen says, based on your regression model, are there any findings relating specifically to Chinese assets in Latin America, given that a significant concentration of Chinese investments in mining and the energy sector is found there? And Chen is from Georgetown University. So why don't you circle back on those two and make any final remarks, and we'll call it a day.
Sure. Regarding the question on the opportunities to engage with Chinese firms and SOEs on physical and climate risks, I think the most important is about the information, the disclosure, because it's not only about Chinese firms. And like before, like 5 years ago, like for most firms, when they having those overseas investment or like assets or M&As, very few of them have considered the physical climate risks into consideration. Okay, so I think one of the suggestions of implications of the study is that firms should take those climate risks, including like transitional climate risk, physical climate risks, into consideration. And in order to do that, the first step is to have like, for instance, like climate risk assessment when they are having those investments. Because for most of those assets, it will be there for like 20 to 30 years. It's a long time. And also climate risks is a long time risk. So it's worthwhile for all those infrastructures to have those risk assessments in advance, the climate risk assessment. And I think that's the biggest suggestion. And what can international partners do, which is like those international financial institutions or like even the local banks, when they are trying to finance this project, they could also provide some guidelines on to those investors in terms of like encourage them to disclose, to assess those physical climate risks, which is like not an easy job, but it's important. But we are doing it not because it's easy. Okay. The next question from Duowei Chen about any findings relating to Chinese assets in Latin America, given its significant concentrations of Chinese investments in mining and energy sector. Again, I think this is similar to Kehan's question earlier, like, do we have any findings in different regions? Like here it's question on Latin America, and I think Kehan asked about Southeast Asia. For now, we haven't conducted analysis like by region, but I think as a next step, we will do those kinds of analysis at granular level, perhaps focus on Latin America and also have a focus on Africa and Southeast Asia, and see whether there are like differences among those regions and among different sectors. Yeah, we will follow up and trying to conduct those analyses. Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot, Xia. Great presentation and great questions from all of you in the audience. I want to invite you to a couple more events like these over this week and next. Tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. I'll be having a conversation with Zhong Xiaojin, the Chinese Executive Director to the International Monetary Fund, on China's approaches to international economic policy. If you go to our webpage, you can register for that and join us there tomorrow morning. On Monday, with colleagues at the Heinrich Boll Foundation and the Institute for Sustainable Finance at SOAS, we will be launching a global proposal on a global debt relief effort, which consists of a pact of debt relief by creditor countries in exchange for investments in a green recovery that is also socially inclusive. And we'll be joined by two keynote speakers, the Honorable Mia Mottley from Barbados and the Honorable Gordon Brown, former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. And on Wednesday, we'll have our own non-resident fellow, Yan Wang, to present a paper that she's just completed on Chinese debt sustainability in Southern African countries. That'll be at the China Research Colloquium. So if you go to our webpage, www.bu.edu/GDP, click on events, and you'll be able to see all these events. Come register, and we look forward to continuing this global conversation about Chinese overseas economic activity. Until then, we'll see you. Thank you very much for coming, and thanks Xia Li for a great presentation.
Thank you.